Hello, I'm Walter Cronkite.
I got a call from Ed Murrow who wanted me to come to work at CBS. Now that I had a family and a mortgage, I thought, well, why not?
Evening one, the news.
So that was the beginning.
This is Walter Cronkite. Our interview with the senator will be entirely unrehearsed.
Oh, glad to see you.
Well, it's good to be with you. Tension is mounting here at Cape Canaveral.
Everything we did was for the first time.
And you were there. Behind me, you see the course of the Explorer.
Walter was one of the big guys in those days to me.
I think it's too far down for that now.
He was very demanding of himself, and ergo, he was demanding of us.
Hell no, we won't go! Hell no, we won't go!
The American people were confused.
The firing still goes on.
They were confounded by what was going on, even as I was.
But the only rational way out then will be to negotiate.
I recall that LBJ said that if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the war.
Up, 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 everybody. It's your birthday. Getting out in the open air, particularly in the summertime, the spring, the fall, boy, that's living. President Eisenhower this morning is back.
Mrs. Eisenhower grabbed Betsy's hand and said, "My dear, is Ike going to drive?"
President Reagan today.
Reagan was funny and loved a good joke. The dirtier, the better.
It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Cronkite.
Call me Walter.
You dirty rat! You get out there! Why don't you?
I said, "Tell me, Frank, what about these allegations of mafia connections?" Wham!
We have ignition.
An indescribable day here at America's spaceport.
It's terrific. In the hostile environment of outer space.
I must confess, I flunked physics. I studied like the devil to understand that stuff. Most of the day, I didn't have keenly felt emotions, except for the moment when I had to say that the president was dead.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Oswald, the commission tells us, fired 3 shots.
You know, all these conspiracy theories, I don't believe for 1 minute it could have been kept a secret for all these years. I just fell into whatever it is I do naturally.
There was plenty to report.
I never took any elocution lessons, no diction lessons. What you see, I'm afraid, is what you get.
Man on the way to the moon.
This is a CBS News special, Cronkite Remembers, with Walter Cronkite, his family, and his friends.
All his life, when everybody was agonizing over what they wanted to be when they grew up, that's all he ever wanted to be, was a reporter.
My family were Dutch, original New Amsterdam Dutch. My grandfather moved from upper New York State around the turn of the century out to the Middle West, St. Joe, Missouri. My grandfather was a dentist, as was my father. I was born in St. Joe in 1916. We moved to Kansas City when I was 2. My earliest memories are about having to go to school. I didn't care much about the whole idea of going to kindergarten. We were far from impoverished, nothing of the kind. Certainly weren't rich in any way. I took music lessons, piano lessons, didn't like those at all. I hated practicing. I remember one time I even tried to pretend that I had a broken arm so I could get onto my piano lesson. I don't know why I didn't think the teacher would call my mother and sympathize about the broken arm. She did, and that was the end of that ploy. My mother and father were part of the post-World War I jazz generation, if you please, kind of living it up. They were very good parents, paid a lot of attention to me, an only child, probably too much. Prohibition came in 1920. I had nothing to do with it. I was only 3 years old at the time. But a few years later, the revenuers raided a house right down the block from us. Turned out to be a major bootleg operation. I remember them out there breaking those bottles in the driveway and the liquor flowing down the gutter. My father was absolutely devastated. I got a taste of the news business fairly early on. At 6 or something, I delivered magazines, and then later on I sold newspapers on the street, had a newspaper route. I remember when President Harding died, and I couldn't wait to tell somebody else. I rushed down the street with a copy of the paper to my friend Albert Darling, and I said, "Albert, look at that picture. That's the last picture you'll ever see of President Harding." Proved that I could be both pontifical and wrong very early in life. We moved to Houston when I was 10. No television, of course, but we had the movies and we had a radio. Oh boy, did we gather around that radio. Fibber McGee and Molly, and, Amos and Andy, Lone Ranger. They were regulars. I particularly remember a movie called Wings. Boy, those flying sequences of World War I fighter planes buzzing about. The pilots could see each other out the cockpit, and the scarves flying, the helmets. And, oh, it made a major impression on me. Well, it perhaps reveals too much of my character that the movie stars of that period that I remember were all voluptuous women.
Gee, I've had some swell times on penthouse parties.
Jean Harlow, all the young guys went to every movie Jean Harlow made.
Of all the dumb bunnies.
But growing up wasn't all fun and fantasy. Even when we were kids, the real world and its problems sometimes intruded. One thing you couldn't escape was the issue of race. When we first moved to Houston, I watched one night as an acquaintance of my father's punched a young black delivery boy in the face for coming around the front of the house instead of the back. He hit him and said, "That'll teach you, nigger, to put your foot on a white man's porch." Well, my father was outraged, and we left the man's house. I was never prouder of my dad than that night. The Depression hit while I was in high school in Houston, and those were mighty tough days. The worst, I guess, were during President Roosevelt's bank holiday. He closed all the banks to try to save a few of them, and everybody simply ran out of cash. There wasn't any. And while my dad wasn't poor, he got down to his last dime. We actually didn't have any food left in the house. And, while my mother denied it to her dying day, I know darn good and well she made hamburgers out of dog food. I guess today you'd call them Alpo burgers. When I was 16, a bunch of us just graduated from high school. We pooled our money and took the train to Chicago for the 1933 World's Fair, a century of progress. And we actually saw a little of the progress. So we visited Sally Rand's exhibit, dancing behind a fan, nude, presumably. And then we saw the first exhibit, presumably, of television, or at least one of the early exhibits of television. They had a big black box on one side of the stage, another on the other side. This one took your picture, and you, boy, gosh, miraculously there was the picture appearing in the other black box. And they'd invite people from the audience up, and naturally I volunteered. Well, we'd just seen a guy down the midway playing 2 clarinets at once. So I had to imitate this fellow playing 2 clarinets at once. It did establish, I guess, a couple of things. First of all, there is a little bit of ham in me. And the second was that I could honestly say to all of my colleagues, I was in television long before you were.
Next on Cronkite Remembers, Radio Days.
Notre Dame's ball on their own 35.
And a young reporter's first big story.
The oil field workers themselves, whose own children were in there, tears streaming down their faces,